So when it comes to, there's a lot of like weird overlaps with race and sexuality. And so there's a long history of race and sex. So one of the things that we should probably talk about is this idea of black hypersexuality. But there's a mythos of black hypersexuality that pervades race relations. And actually is responsible for a lot of the violence behind how we interact with races, with people of minority races. So particularly black people, so African Americans. So did anybody catch what the idea of hypersexuality is, or from this chapter? Or anybody want to guess? Yeah.
Was it the fact that they thought that like black people have bigger genitalia, so we're more sexual people, and like almost that kind of led into them being more animalistic in a way?
Yeah. So that's the idea of black hypersexuality. So, and we're all kind of aware of this culturally, even if we don't normally talk about it, right? That culturally we talk about, particularly black people, as having bigger genitalia, being more promiscuous, being more sexual, right? So all these things, it's particularly black males, right, that we present this way. That black male sexuality we present this way. And in some ways, and there's a weird paranoia that, like, amongst whites, that black sexuality, like black people are literally sort of better at sex. So there's this this pervading sort of mythos that underlines our culture, kind of unspoken thing that, generally speaking, most people, even to this day, if you were to poll most Americans, they probably believe this is true, right? This has long historical roots. In the 19th century in particular, there is an obsession with mapping black sexuality, like particularly amongst scientists, particularly amongst medical doctors, right? So there's tons of studies on the difference between black genitalia and white genitalia, as well as things like the physical bodies, right? So basically, there's an obsession with black bodies, but it's not necessarily and this is sort of a question, culturally, do we generally treat African Americans as better looking or more attractive than white people? It's sort of this weird contradiction.
No, because like when we were talking, we were saying like, oh, like our idea of like beauty is like, oh, like white and like straight, like blonde hair or whatever, and that's like not what black women have at all.
Yeah. So the idea, right, of sexual beauty is particularly white. That white people are treated as being more attractive. So there's like this weird combination that basically like black sexuality has through white discourse, right? That it is in essence both like heightenedly desirable and repulsive. So it's this weird combination of desire and repulsion. Do you guys see that in terms of culturally? Do you guys see how that's true? Like even if you think of like, these are common media portrayals even to this day, right? This sort of idea of black sexuality being better, but less attractive, less appealing, right? So, okay, so why do you guys, I'm going to ask you guys sort of why do you think this is the case? Where do you think this comes from? Because this is interconnected with some of the stuff we talked about, particularly when we were talking about scientific racism. What are some fears that undergird white culture in terms of black people and their sexuality? What do you think? Because there's also like a fear of this sexuality.
Was it for like polygenesis, like they didn't want the races to mix?
Yeah.
Or like the offspring would be infertile?
Yeah, so it's basically kind of grows out of this fear of this philosophy, or this mythos grows out of the fear of hybridity, right? Particularly biological hybridity, right? So it's the fear that people will, that essentially like the races will interbreed and cease to exist, right? In a lot of ways, it's the fear of the end of white people, right? It's sort of the fear. So this fear undergirds this, right? And also like basically is the reason why this myth exists, right? This idea exists. Does it make sense? So whenever you see those portrayals, you could think of it that way, that they're actually like portrayals of fears. It's sort of like a nightmarish thing, as opposed to something actually thought of as positive. And there's tons of ways in which this happens. You know, like I said, you can see this in films and stuff like that. Like, and not to like talk about something taboo, but like this is very common in things like pornography, right? Even more common in pornography than it is in everyday life, right? This sort of idea of black sexuality. And in particular the fear of white women and black men, right? How does this relate to, so I said there's a relationship, like this mythos is also very much so related to violence against African Americans. Is anybody aware of this historically? Like, how is this used to justify, how is black hypersexuality used to justify violence against black men in particular? What's something that most people who are most African Americans who are executed in the South in the early 20th century, what were they executed for?
Looking at her, like, wolf whistling at a white woman.
Oh yeah, so if you're talking about lynchings, yeah, a lot of times it's when black men interact with a white woman that they become lynched. And actually, like, if you think of, like, there's a lot of examples of even things just like black men talking to white women in a, like, going to a grocery store or whatever, right? And then that resulting in them being killed, right? Essentially, it's a way to police white women against this idea of black sexuality, sort of keeping black sexuality separate, right? What about like when you like most people who are legally executed? Because if you're talking in the early 20th century, the execution rates for African American men is significantly higher. What are most of them being executed for? Rape, right? And this is actually tied into this too. So, in a lot of our, in a weird way, and I'm not sure how aware you guys are of this, but we exist in a culture that sort of glorifies rape. You know, you watch movies, so often men do very rapey things and women like it, right? And particularly in sex scenes and things like that, right? Rape and sexual assault, we have a culture that actually views this in a lot of ways more positively than it should, right? And a lot of this is also tied up in the racialization of sex. So like black sexuality, even though it's often treated as more pleasant for women, right, is also treated as essentially like often being itself tied up with force, physical violence, sexual assault, rape. And most of the time when people were executed in the past, it was for rape, right? Most of the lynchings involve people who are being accused of rape, right? What are the, why do you think there's so many accusations of rape coming out against African Americans in the early 20th century? What might be some reasons? Just looking for guesses. Do I need to make you guys do jumping jacks, get your energy flowing a little? What are some guesses of why that might be the case? What do you think? What do you think normally happens when white women and black men, because I mean, like, culturally speaking, like, even if there's this huge divide, like, people have sex, right? Like, they do, right? People are attracted to each other. This happens regardless of which colony we're talking about in the United States, thinking of it as colonial setting. Regardless of which colony, like, this is not uncommon. It's not uncommon for people of two different races to have sex. So, like, what happens if you're in the early 20th century and you're a woman who has sex with a black man and somebody finds out? What do you think?
I assume you got raped instead of like wanting to have sex with them.
Yeah, this pressure to essentially claim that you were raped, right? So there's a huge cult that's sort of built in, which reinforces this image, right? And this is often very common portrayals in in the early 20th century in movies. Like, if anyone's an old film buff, right? Like, often African American men are portrayed as attempting to rape white women. It's a very common portrayal. So here you get very much so this, in a lot of the weirdness we have surrounding sexuality in African Americans to this day revolve around this problem, right? Makes sense? And I think actually, if you're reading it, and particularly like we're gonna look at like some more like psychoanalytic like stuff on race later, right? If you're reading this in a more psychological way, right? You could argue that I think a lot of the violence and aggression towards African American males stems from this fear in our culture, right? Make sense? So, in that first chapter that, in chapter, I always forget the numbers, chapter 6, right, on the sexual politics of black womanhood, how does she orient in this? So this is dancing behind it, right? She's sort of assuming that you're familiar with this history, right? And there's a lot written on this. We're going to look at something a bit more contemporary that involves this later on when we talk about stuff about the Caribbean and sex. But how's our author using it? How is Collins talking about hypersexuality? Because this is to some degree the significance for Collins of homosexuality and race. What's the opposite of hypersexuality? To some, yeah, you would think it would be asexuality, but we don't really talk about, we don't have a lot of like cultural things floating around people who are asexual, right? Like, most people don't even think, like, I actually used to have a friend who was like literally like flat out asexual. Like, he didn't have any interest in it in any way, shape, or form, didn't date people. Very nice guy. We were good friends. But anyways, it's still are. But anyways, the point is like, we don't think of that as a population normally. You know, we don't think of people who are just literally like, no interest at all. Did you have your hand up? I thought somebody, no. I was just like corner of my eyes, fogged up glasses. Okay. Yeah, so in terms of defining like normative white sexuality. It defines itself in contrast between black hypersexuality, which is heterosexual. So as a mythos, we sort of define it as a sort of like heterosexualism, like, like to the nth degree, right? And homosexuality, right? So that's described as a tension, right? So on the one end, we define ourselves against homosexuality. You can think about all the amounts of jokes that people make surrounding homosexuality, right? It's a regular orienting thing, right? So white normative sexuality is, on the one hand, understood as the opposite of homosexuality. On the other hand, it's understood as the opposite of hypersexuality. And so here's the question that Colin wants to ask. Where's the place of black women in this framework? What do you think? Where's the place of black women in this framework? You guys are particularly quiet today. You don't have to worry about being wrong in this class. Like, just say stuff. Most of the time I'm asking you questions I don't expect you to know, right? So this isn't like a quiz, right? Like, what do you think? If you were to guess within this framework. So on the one end you have homosexuality, on the other end you have hypersexuality of black men, right? You have white men in the middle. Where's African American women? They're not there, right? So in essence, like, we have a tendency to view African American women as asexual, right? So culturally, we don't have a clear place, a clear expression of African American women's sexuality. In some ways, this kind of weirdly makes African American women suspect. Right? And talking about it, we don't even have a language of asexuality, like we were saying, right? So like, in a lot of ways it makes them suspect. Sometimes, right, we think of African American women is a sort of like proxy homosexuality. Sometimes it gets connected here into hypersexuality, but it's pretty clearly it's pretty much undefined, right? So culturally, we have a tendency not to think of African American women as sexual beings at all. Instead, what sort of roles do we associate with African American women? And we can, going back to like what dances through this whole thing is these sort of images, right? These, what she's calling controlling images, what we were calling ideology in the last class, right? And we can see that like the different images will orient black women in different ways, right? So like you could think of this as being like the Jezebel image, right? This is more like the sort of like matriarch image, right? Masculine women, right? You guys kind of see that? So like, in a lot of ways, yeah. So basically like outside of the system, but often when it is portrayed, it's portrayed in a specifically negative fashion, right? African American women's sexuality is never anything positive. So we associate them with other kinds of roles, right? And we think about those images. What are most of the defining images? What do they revolve around? What aspect of women's lives? Even if they're negative. They revolve around children. So there's a link between African American women and motherhood as a concept, and that's the defining relationship that gets pulled out, right? So culturally we identify African American women as mothers, right? Not positively, negatively, but that's what they're identified as, right? African American men are not usually identified in a parental sort of way, right? They're often being portrayed in heightened sexual ways that are somewhat independent, right? Make sense? Okay, cool. So that's basically the overarching theme, right? And so her first question, we nodded at this before, right? The defining question in this chapter is like, why are African American women have a tendency to be really hostile, particularly even African American feminists really hostile towards lesbians, right? And the reason why is, the reason Collins is going to claim that that's, the reason why that exists is because of this weird position, right? So like African American women can divorce themselves from another negative stereotype, right? Another part of the hierarchy simply by you know, to some degree otherizing, right, lesbians. Make sense? Which is kind of a big thing if you're talking in feminist circles, right? Like, anyways. So, as in like, it's an odd thing for feminists to do, right? Okay, let's move over to chapter 7. In chapter 7, we have this, chapter 7 is on black women's love relationships. So I said I was going to try to hand it over to you so I don't talk too much. What are you guys pulling out of this chapter? Anything you want to talk about? You notice? Yeah, go ahead.
One thing I noticed was there is a lot of kind of background things to think about as a black woman who's dating that have to do with like her race and those expectations of like what she's going to do as a black woman instead of just kind of having freedom to date whoever.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot more going on behind those relationships and the way that they're thought about. Yeah, totally. How do you see that? Can you give some more specific examples?
Like, there's an expectation that they won't date outside their race, but they also feel like they're unwanted by black men. And there's also an expectation that they'll date heterosexually and not like of the same sex.
Yeah. Yeah. And what does that, it points out an outcome of that. Did anybody catch this? What's a common outcome of the things surrounding black women dating?
They remain single?
Yeah, African American women remain single at a much higher rate than any other part of our population, right? So this is so basically like, yeah, African American women are often forced into this weird sort of singlehood, you know. So that's definitely one of the major themes of this. Which also gets us kind of back into sexual politics again, right? How do we see this narrative? Because like, this isn't just a story, like any other thing that we talk about in terms of ideology, like even people absorb this and act upon it. So like this isn't something that's just sort of like, well, in the past people said this and we see it on TV, right? But it's quite literally like guides actions, right? So there's a weird politics to sex that a lot of times we just ignore. Right? There's a huge amount of politics in sexuality and who dates who and why, right? And this chapter is kind of trying to dig into that a little, right? Like, what is the sexual politics of black womanhood, right? Which is, in a lot of ways, a heightened marginality, right? So we see playing out, like, so thinking about intersectionality, like what we've been talking about, right? That there's this sort of matrix of domination and people are dominated in different ways, right? You see the greater amount of domination in terms of sexual politics for black women and them being removed, right? Sometimes quite literally just removed from dating and sexuality in general. Yeah. What else do we notice from this chapter? What else do people have? What does she mean by love relationships? She has a pretty broad definition here. Anybody catch that? How do we almost automatically think of love when we hear the word in Western culture, modern Western culture? What do we mean by love usually?
Romantic or sexual.
Yeah, we generally have a tendency to think of it as romantic and sexual, right? You don't think of having loving relationships with other people, right? So you don't think of your close friends, you don't think of yourself as loving them, right? Like it sounds a little bit different like in Christian discourse, like love often has a broader sense, right, to it. But like popular culture-wise, usually there's an automatic link. And so what do we often mean by love in terms of sexual relationships? We're boiling it down to what? How do we pick our partners? What's the whole goal of our sexual relationships usually? As a culture. Why do we date?
Married and have a family.
What's that?
To get married.
Ideally, but is that why most people date? No, why do people date?
Companionship.
Companionship, friendship. But do we really pick other people that we date on the basis of how good of a companion they will be?
Typically pick based on attraction.
Yeah, so we have a tendency to reduce loving relationships down to quite literally the act of sex, right? And even like we get married on the basis of sexual attraction usually, right? It's not about like I'm going to just share a weird aside. So like I'm like totally not an emotional person at all. I'm like horribly analytic, and this makes it really awkward dating when you're young, right? And so like when I met my wife, I was like, we're really compatible. So I like basically like drew up an argument about all the things that we lined up on and was like even if we're not attracted to each other yet, we should get married. Cause like, look at how great we're gonna have of a partnership if we get married, right? Totally a great way, but most people that would be horrible way of introducing yourself to basically like bring up the idea of dating, right? Like, well, you know, we line up religiously, we have the same ideals about how we like what we want out of life, we both like to travel and move around, like we should just like get together and become partners, right? Culturally, we don't think that way, right? Like that's a good chunk of like marriage practices of the past are done that way. Like a lot of arranged marriages are done that way, even to this day, right? Like you look at compatibility and then you place people together. A lot of the volatileness of sexual relationships comes down to the fact in our culture that we only believe in attraction as like basically sexual attraction, the act of sex as like the foremost thing we should be caring about, right? And all that sort of like romance love stuff is really just like a backdoor way of talking about sex, right? So like quite literally like that's kind of what's dancing behind that, right? So she wants to be like, to understand black women's love relationships because they've been sort of desexualized and locked out of this system, we almost have to understand love in a far broader way, right? That you can often have more loving relationships with other people outside of sexual attraction, right? That you can have closeness and intimacy with other people in non-sexual ways, and that's actually how most black women experience their relationships according to Collins. Make sense? So when we get back to this idea of motherhood, right? Yeah.
Do you think that like the hookup culture nowadays has a huge part to play in just looking for attraction in other people rather than actual love when looking at somebody as a partner, kind of?
Yeah. I think that in some ways that I would say the relationship is probably reversed. Because like the idea of romantic love has a longer origin, you know, and then the hookup culture in a lot of ways is just sort of like a reified, like it's like you distilled it down to its essence, and it's basically what it is, right? But if you think about it too, like there's a whole history, like if you guys are ever interested in this, like there's a really interesting piece by, do you guys know who Friedrich Engels is? He's an important philosopher from the 19th century. He has this whole, it's actually like one of the first things that gets sort of like sometimes labeled as feminism, but it's like one of the first like variants of it. And it's this whole discussion of the birth of romantic love as a concept. And initially romantic love is supposed to be for people who are not married. Like romantic love originally grows as a concept of basically like courtly love of people who are cheating on their spouses. And this is basically in the 16 and 1700s, that's how it's talked about, right? And then it only later gets sort of applied to like marriage relationships, right? So like our ideas of romantic love, I think, predate like hookup culture as we think of it today, right? But it's tied up in very similar things, I think. So I think that they're interrelated, but I think romantic love is a concept, right? Most people have not gotten married for romantic reasons throughout history. This is actually a very rare way of deciding who your partner is. And we have a tendency to trans-historicize that, to turn it into something normal and across all time. But it's actually a really weird, aberrant thing that Western culture alone did. Make sense? Cool. Other thoughts on this chapter?
Talked a bit about abuse, and how like black women will tend to stay in abusive relationships because it's what they're supposed to do,
Yeah.
or even support that abusive spouse through anything.
Yeah. So talking about abusiveness within African American culture, right? Because there are higher rates of spousal abuse. There's higher rates of sexual assault and things like that in African American communities, which like anything else, Collins is going to want to historicize. Did anybody catch the historicization of this? Where this comes from? This is in, I can give you guys a page number. This is the protecting and controlling stuff. It kind of starts on page 169. And this is also kind of Collins explaining part of black masculinity and how it works differently than white masculinity, or at least like normative white masculinity. I think we can back up here. So how is it that, and I'm gonna de-racialize this statement because I think you get into some difficult contradictions for like between working class and middle class men, right? But like, how would you define like middle class white masculinity? What are the characteristics of it? What makes you masculine? What makes you, I guess, like the archetype of what a man should be like within our culture?
Like when you're the primary breadwinner or something.
Yeah, so one thing that's very important for middle class masculinity is the ability to make money, right? A good living, right? You got to be fairly well off. What else? What makes it, what are our ideals for white masculinity? Just looking for guesswork, guys. It's not from the book. Can't get it wrong. It's your own culture. What do we expect from middle class white men? What makes them act right?
Like traditional, like just being a gentleman, opening doors, bringing flowers, stuff like that.
Yeah, to some degree being very polite, appropriate, you know, saying the right things at the right time, right? Tactful, both in romantic relationships and outside of them, you know. What else?
Like non-emotional.
Yeah, so that's actually a big part of, it's something that we could probably argue is changing for middle class white masculinity, but like, yeah, not being super emotional, just called me out as, you know, being very hegemonic in the thing I just said earlier. Right? Being very, very heteronormative white male and saying I'm not emotional. Right? So these are characteristics about, what about men? They don't have to do with men's bodies. They're not a physicalization, right? Like, the power of white masculinity is the power of money, right? Like, and you think about like body, like, has anybody ever interacted in their classes with somebody named Pierre Bourdieu? He's probably one of the more important sociologists of the last 30 to 40 years. Pierre Bourdieu talks a lot about like the different body types that people develop as a result of different class cultures, right? And you think about like the middle class white male body, what forms of exercise do they have a tendency to do? What's their body supposed to look like? What are classy forms of exercise or sport?
Running.
Yeah, like running is probably like the archetype form of exercise. What kind of body does running give you?
Lean.
Yeah, give you like a thin, lean body. It's not a body that you would use for physical force, right? It's a body that essentially doesn't need it. Right? That's kind of what it communicates, right? You think about that versus like, what kind of exercise do predominantly working class men do? What forms of exercise do working class men have a tendency to do?
Heavy lifting.
Yeah, resistance training. What kind of body does that give you?
More stocky.
Big, strong body, right? Like that. The same division exists within between African Americans and Caucasians, right? Like the ideal body for a white Caucasian is sort of like the tennis player body, right? Thin, like fit, quick, right? Body, right? The ideal body for African Americans is big and strong, right? Like, we have a tendency to biologize those differences, but they're not biological. They actually are how we use our bodies, right? What we use them for. Why do you think that is? What's the value system here? Why would working class people want to be strong? Lower class people want to be strong. Why do middle class people not really care about it? Or even in some ways make a show of not having it?
Maybe the amount of manual labor they do.
So it could have to do with the work, right? Like, you have a body that fits your job, right? Do most poor people in the United States do heavy manual labor? No, we live in deindustrialization, right? Like, most people who are poor in the United States don't do that kind of work. They work in the service economy in one way or another. It could be a holdover, right? How else could we interpret it? What is being really strong good for? Strong arms, strong back, strong shoulders. What is it good for? What sort of athlete has that kind of body? Let's think of it that way. Big, stocky, big arms, lots of resistance training.
I mean, it could be good for like protection of your property.
Yeah, what I was trying to nod at with is like, the people who have those kind of bodies that you see as athletes are like boxers, kickboxers, ultimate fighting people, right? Things like that, right? you know, football players, which is a very, very aggressive sport, right? It's very, you know, so you think about so partially tied up in that, right, is a protection narrative, right? That you're protecting yourself, that you protect your loved ones, right? Physical strength becomes like a sign of our ability to do that, right? Make sense? So what's the origin? So thinking about like this tying of violence and this sort of like idea about masculinity, right? Like what does Collins tie it to for African Americans? Anybody catch this? This is where I was trying to point you in the history. And that this has an influence on roles between black women and black men to this day, according to Collins.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. So my question was basically like, how does this idea, right, this idea of protection tie in? What's the origin of this historically for Collins? Where does this come from? And this is, once again, to give you guys the page number again. This is where it starts on page 169 is where this discussion starts. Carries over into 170 mostly.
Did it come right after emancipation because black men weren't happy with the way black women were treated in slavery?
Yeah. So like there's a long history of essentially black women are victimized a lot under slavery, right? There's not really a lot anybody can do about it, right? So there is a lot of sexual assault and rape by white men of black women during slavery, right? Where do you get, this is going to sound funny and a bit contradictory, right? Because it is a violent and oppressive system, but where do you get your protection from in slavery? What makes sure that you have a living? What makes sure that people don't take advantage of you? What's your only protection come from? The person who owns you, right? Even though they're the person who's most likely to victimize you, when it comes to anyone else, they're sort of like the ones who are in charge of that, right? So there isn't a culture of that, of protecting oneself within slavery, right? And in fact, it would be pretty antithetical and would probably get you killed pretty quickly. So after emancipation, essentially, like there becomes like this thing that African American men become very protective and protecting, right? And that's still a part of the culture of the relationship between African American men and women, is that protection is a big deal, right? What's the danger or difficulty of that? What does protection sometimes lead to, according to Collins? We could just remove ourselves from Collins and be like, what would be a danger of having a culture where physical protection is a big part of your relationship?
Control behaviors.
Yeah. And so there's a relationship between protection and control, that black women's sexuality becomes controlled by men in a very different way than it does within white culture. Which she wants to claim is the reason why that so that's essentially her historicization of the violence within black women's roles. So it's not necessarily, so Collins isn't trying to say that black men are naturally more violent or something like that, right? Collins is instead trying to say that these differences are a result of these sort of like, in some ways they grow out of the fact that dominant masculinity doesn't need to do those sort of things. Even to this day, is physical protection more important if you are poor? Yeah, so there's actually a need for that as well. And so she talks about that African American women even seek that out in their partners, right? In a way that often white women do not, right? And that's sort of tied up in that. Once again, the focus of Collins is usually going to be race. I think we could extend that into a class-based argument as well, right? That I think you see very similar things like distinctions between like lower class whites and middle class whites there as well, right? Protection's a bigger deal, right? In terms of relationships, but also they were also like poorer whites also have a higher rate of things like sexual assault, sexual violence as well. So you could historicize that within the same sort of thing. Okay, everyone makes all that makes sense. Anything else people want to talk about from this chapter? We got one more chapter. Awesome, perfect. We'll time out. We're just right. Okay, let's talk about chapter 8. So what did you guys get out of the chapter on black women and motherhood? So we're talking about a different type of relationship here. There's 5 different themes that this revolves around. Let's see how many of them I can get you guys to find. Do you have ebooks?
No, I don't have a book today. I left it in my room.
That's okay, it happens. Like,
Yeah.
just asking, right? Like,
Yeah.
curious. Because you can buy ebook
Yeah.
versions of pretty much everything, and they're cheaper. And I know a lot of students do that. Okay, what are some of the? What are the themes? Look at titles. Try to spark your memory. At least in theory, you've all read this, right? So how is... And so this is in essence like, these are not controlling images of motherhood like we were seeing before, right? These are instead black women's experience of motherhood, right? That's what we're seeing in this chapter. So what are some themes? Who gets to be mothers? This is an interesting theme. Within black culture, how does motherhood differ in terms of who does mothering? This ties into some of your history of the family as well. That's our first theme. If you guys need a page number, it's on page 192. Who does the mothering in African American culture? How is motherhood different in terms of who? Who does the mothering in white culture? I think this is why this sounds like a confusing question.
I mean, like, the mother, like, does it,
Yeah! Exactly. The mother. How does that differ?
Because it's kind of like anyone who, like, the mother trusts, like, can do it since, like, she's usually working.
Yeah, because like, so like one very big difference, one of the themes is this idea of women-centered networks of people mothering, right? So like mothering takes on this very communal thing, right? And she refers to this as other mothering, right? That like, who raises a child? Well, it all depends, right? There's a lot of, so like if you have to work and you don't get to spend much time with your child, even if you have to relocate and go someplace else, is this a sign of you being a failure as a mother in the African American community? No. Right? As long as you're still being responsible and making sure that they're taken care of, right? It doesn't matter whether it's the grandparent who spends the most time with the child. It doesn't matter whether it's a cousin. It doesn't matter whether it's a neighbor or a friend, right? Is that true within white culture, middle class culture? Like how would you feel about somebody if they were a mother and they maybe only spent like an hour with their kid a day and otherwise they just sort of like, you know, gave it to their grandmother to take care of? How would we talk about that person?
Frowned upon.
What's that?
It's kind of frowned upon.
It's kind of frowned upon. So in another way, what's the downside to that? What's the downside of mothering having to, and within white culture, mothering having to be only done by the mother?
Mothers who are respected take on a lot more.
Even mothers take on a lot more. What else? It's alienating. Right? This is one of the themes that I think pervade this section, right? Is that, like, in a lot of ways, white culture is very alienating. It talks about black people losing this sort of sense of these centered networks when they move to the suburbs. What are the suburbs like? Like, you go, how close are you with your neighbors usually in the suburbs? Do you even necessarily know your neighbors in the suburbs? No, that's why the houses are so far apart, right? You don't actually want to be close with people, right? You essentially are trying to put distance, right? Why is it that people have these big sprawling homes? Well, one reason is to show off, right? But there's another reason. You don't want anyone else in your space. You want to be completely out of the eyes of everyone else around you, right? And so like it's a very atomizing culture, right? So like what Collins is kind of pointing out is that traditionally African Americans have not lived in those kinds of communities, right? And motherhood is in a lot of ways, suburban motherhood looks like the landscape, right? Like you essentially have to take on all the responsibility yourself. If somebody else helps you, what do? Where do a lot of middle class women, like if they're not taking care of their kids, who takes care of them? Like let's say they're working, they have a job, full-time job. Who takes care of the kids when they're working?
Daycare and nanny.
Yeah, somebody you pay, right? Doing services for free in a neighborly way is not a part of white culture, right? You pay for services, right? So like, it's also kind of, you get a weird contradiction here that we would look down on people if the child spent most of the time with their grandmother or their cousin or their neighbor, but yet like it's perfectly acceptable if the child spends most of the day with somebody you pay. Right? It's kind of a weird, if you think about it, like, so it's weird that we would offer that kind of judgment up so quickly, right? So that's kind of one of the themes, is this idea of other mothering. And that women find a lot of, talking about women often being single, right, often not having relationships, they find a lot, in women within these sort of women-centered networks of childcare, right, even ones who don't have children and end up doing childcare, like they find a lot of their meaning there, right? I see people looking out. Are we that close? We still have 5 minutes. We can get a couple more themes in. Okay, what are some other themes that people caught? Anybody catch this socialization for survival thing on page 198? Here's a tension. So this theme is one in which there's a sort of pervading tension with how black women train their daughters in particular. Page 198 is where we see this. Yeah.
They teach them to fit into the sexual politics of black women.
They teach them to fit into the sexual politics of black women. What else do they teach? There's another thing that they do as well.
They also encourage them to like go against those images though.
Yeah. So there's this tension that they like to survive, one has to like embrace, like, and this is true if you're oppressed, right? And this kind of pervades like our discussion last class, right? This idea of people sort of like rebelling in quiet ways, right? So like you see this in one of the themes of black motherhood is that you train your children, one, to be subservient whether it's sexual politics, whether it's work politics. If you're poor, work at least for Collins, right, is going to be seen as like basically oppressive, right? Like work is people taking advantage of you. And so like the idea is you train people that you have to do those kinds of work. It has to be unpleasant, but you should be trying to get out of it. You will have to have those sort of sexual relationships that are not necessarily productive for you, but you should try to avoid it, right? You should be looking for something else. In the previous chapter, there's a whole section where she talks about within black women's voices and particularly music, right? There's this whole idea of the good man, right? Looking for the good man. And you can kind of see that here too, right? So like, there's a contradiction that like you simultaneously train people to be oppressed, but also not to value that. And so like how you end up negotiating that is really hard. Because essentially like if you just treat people to like slough off like the oppressive work and the sexual relationships, they're essentially what's going to happen to black daughters when they grow up. You're going to end up what? Alone and poor. Right? So the means of escape are often in themselves things that are likely to oppress them. So that's one of the major themes about motherhood is like the need to navigate this. Just to sort of end quickly, I think we're getting close on time. Yep. So despite the fact there's another contradiction, right, is that women often find their power, right? Black women often find their power through motherhood, both in their networks, that's one way, and then they also talk about it being often the thing that spurns black women into activism is actually their children, right? So black women find their power in their children, despite the fact that having children often for poor people is what? Difficult and against their own interest, right? So like black women, like essentially having children is exceptionally draining and difficult, even in the best of circumstances, right? It's even worse if you're in a situation of poverty, right? So there's also this weird contradiction that runs through this chapter of them finding power in their motherhood. And often this is going back to like early on we talked about the divide between black feminism and white feminism and how they view motherhood, right? Motherhood is very positive within black feminism, right? It's not so much within white feminism. And you see this tension playing out here that like, yes, women are often oppressed by that, but, right? Okay, any other questions or thoughts in the remaining 1 minute we have left? Awesome. Have a good weekend. I will see you guys on the, I'll see you guys on Tuesday.